All right, my friend, you know what? It's time for the regional breakdown. It's our first one of the year. So give us an overall view of where the market sat last week when we were in the middle of the holidays and what's on the horizon for the week ahead.
Yeah, definitely, Jenny. Well, taking the holiday weekends out of it, the market was actually pretty stable through the past week. Now, going into the Christmas holiday weekend and the New Year's holiday weekend, things definitely got a little volatile. That's mainly due to, shippers changing their tendering patterns, extended transits for facility holiday hours.
Mhm.
But overall, last week, of course, we saw rates increase in just about every region, but they stayed pretty stagnant through the week. Now, coming on this week, I think we're going to start seeing rates fall, and they're going to continue to fall throughout the month of January. I mean, this is something that most people probably anticipate, but I believe we're going to see them fall much faster and harder than they did last year, just because we have a lot of room to go down to where we were through the summer of 2023.
Yeah, we can't sustain 11% of an increase. As much as we would love for carriers to benefit from that, it's not going to happen. In our last episode, we noted that the Northeast and the West Coast were the ones to watch. Why don't we start off this week with the Northeast, as I know we've got some potential snowstorms that may be brewing this weekend. Where are we netting out here?
Well, Jenny, that's exactly why I said it's a region to watch, is because of the snowstorms, but boy, was I wrong. Over the past 2 weeks, the markets with the most movement were actually in the southern part of the country. But taking it back to the Northeast, we did see some weather events, but it wasn't necessarily cold weather. It was actually relatively warm through the Christmas holiday.
Yeah.
And so were the truckload markets, to be quite honest. Now, of course, we did see an average increase of just about 4% on freight originating in the Northeast. But again, like you said, this coming weekend, there's actually some snow coming, and it could impact the freight markets. Now, I don't know about you, but I heard it's supposed to be about a foot in parts of central Pennsylvania, which is a big freight hub. So we could potentially see rates increase in the Northeast going into next week.
Oh, that is going to be real interesting, because it is such an anomaly. It could be 11, it could be a foot, it could be less than that. We just don't know these days. Global warming is real. That said, what about the West Coast? Any potential issues out there with imports? I know I keep talking about it, but just curious.
Actually, Jenny, no issues whatsoever out on the West Coast.
Wow.
This took me by a surprise. Now, I was thinking that, there's probably going to be some potential impacts out on the West Coast for last minute expedite demands. Yeah. But did I underestimate how loose capacity remains out West? After rising through the end of November, the average rate out of the West Coast actually remained nearly unchanged throughout the last 2 weeks. Wow. Now, again, you did have pockets of tightening in states like Arizona and Utah, but California and the Pacific Northwest continued to cool down, which left the overall average rate leaving the region with no upside for carriers whatsoever. So the West Coast is always somewhere to keep an eye on, but in the past 2 weeks, carriers did not get any Christmas presents out there.
Oh, man. All right. Well, what about the Midwest? Why don't we move on over to that area and see if this is one of the regions that showed a little bit of a tightening for carriers?
Well, Jenny, the Midwest did experience some tightening, but it's very market driven. We did experience a winter weather storm last week, which brought the first noticeable snowfall of the year. But I will say, Jenny, there wasn't much ground given to carriers. But the largest freight market by volume, Chicago, did see tender rejections increase over 6%. But again, most of the markets in the Midwest only saw rates increase from 2 to 5% over the last 2 weeks. Now, that's still a noticeable increase and great for carriers, but it wasn't the region with the highest increase.
All right, we're going to get there, I promise. What about the coastal region? What is happening there?
Jenny, I don't want to sound like a broken record. The coastal region followed the same suit as the Midwest. There's pockets of tightening, but overall, we only saw about a 2 to 5% increase, and there's nothing noticeable. But going into this week, I would anticipate the coastal region to lose all of the gains that it experienced over the last 2 weeks, where the Midwest and Northeast, I don't think they're going to lose the gains nearly as fast just due to the winter weather.
Yeah, that's going to be that trifecta is going to be interesting to watch as we head into next week. All right, we're getting closer and closer to the regions to watch for this week. So any major callouts for the Southeast region?
Now, the Southeast took me by a big surprise, and so did the South. So I'm going to actually combine them.
Go for it.
The Southeast is where we saw carriers have the most leverage through the last 2 weeks. Now, the South and Southeast did not trend like the national average to where we actually did see rates steadily increase through the last 2 weeks. The Southeast, on average for freight originating out there, saw an increase from December 18th to today, about 7%, and the South just under 6%. Now, both of these regions don't historically have the greatest increases through the Christmas and New Year's holiday.
Yeah.
So I was pretty surprised. But at the same time, if I was a betting man, these are two regions that are going to fall pretty fast over the next 2 to 3 weeks. These are, still regions that don't have the seasonality strength that the Midwest, Northeast, and usually West Coast does around this time of the year. So I would bet that these two regions are going to lose their gains pretty fast over the next 2 weeks. But I will say, Jenny, there are pockets within both regions that experienced a much higher increase. For instance, in the South, we saw the Laredo market just in the last 7 days, from last Monday to this Monday, experience a 10% increase and average rates for freight originating there. So again, it's very dependent on what lane, what market you're looking at. But overall, boy, did the carriers have a ball in the South and Southeast, because not only were they getting rate increases, but they also got to experience some pretty nice weather if they did pick up one of those, holiday loads that had extra transit due to holiday hours.
Yeah. Wow. What do you think attributed to the flip and what the expectation was here?
Really where capacity sits. I think that a lot of capacity did go, not necessarily home for the holidays, but more local to where they are based out of, which, is big for the Midwest, especially. But honestly, Jenny, I haven't been able to dive too much, but I think that's something that we're going to get into next week is, why did we see such strength in the South and Southeast? Because it's not imports in either of those two locations. So it's definitely something we got to dive farther into.
Nice. Now, I think it only makes sense that we bust out the crystal ball for our first episode of the year. You've made some predictions already, but I'd love for you to tell us what are some of your predictions for January. And then at the end of the month, we'll review where we netted out on those predictions. So we got to keep ourselves accountable here. But Maze, what are some regions you're keeping a close eye on, and any big market swings we should be on the lookout for?
I think overall, we're going to have to keep an eye on the Midwest and Northeast for these, winter weather events.
Yeah.
Other than that, I think the actual trend of the national average is going to continue to decline over the next 3 weeks. If I was a betting man, I'd say we end the month right around the same national average rate per mile that we saw at December 18th before rates started to increase due to the holidays.
Yeah.
And then going into February, I would assume that rates fall even farther back to, where they were in the beginning of November. Now, I do think that, like I said, the South and Southeast have the greatest room to move down, with volume also going to decrease. So again, I'd keep an eye on the Midwest, the Northeast. But if I was a betting man, like I said, if I had a crystal ball, I would tell you that China rejections, without a doubt, are going to fall back below 4%. There's no reason for carriers to be rejecting freight, especially as they're in RFP season. I would also add one more projection that we're going to start seeing the spot the contract difference shrink. Not only this month, but more so next month when you start getting awards coming out of RFPs. So through the month of February and March, we're going to really start seeing the gap between contract and spot rates shrink, which is what's going to keep carriers interested to stay in the market, hoping that, the tides turn sooner. But again, I don't think we're going to see any type of large capacity exit that's going to make an impact on rates just yet in the first half of 2024, unfortunately. But I do think it's going to set us up for a stronger rebound in the second half of 2024. Now, I was hoping it was the first half, but to be honest, Jenny, after the last 2 weeks, I'm really pushing towards the second half of 2024 now.
Yeah, good news for shippers. They get to hold on to that power for a little bit more, which is interesting because I'm looking at my LinkedIn feed and there were some predictions. I won't say from who, but just that it's going to be a pretty rough year ahead for shippers. But maybe not. Maybe they will net out a little bit better through first half of the year.
Well, Jenny, I will tell you, it's all up to the shippers. A lot of people, will go against me and say, hey, it's all about the relationship you have with the shipper. At the end of the day, it's not through these bidding processes. If the shippers want to continue to push down to try to again, somewhat called back some money from the pandemic, that they are actually going to push out capacity faster, which is going to make their business a little more chaotic in the second half of the year. But at the end of the day, it is up to the shippers on where rates fall the first half of the year and how quickly capacity leaves the industry.
Oh, man. Well, we will see where the year ends up, but lots to talk about next week on the show to talk about that any attributions to that market flip that we didn't predict. But that said, Maze, we'll see you next week with an all-new episode of the Transfix Take podcast. It's always a pleasure talking to you, Maze. Until then, as always, drive safely.